Hi guys, this is Maya, and today we will be looking at factoring uh, trinomials or factoring quadratics, and we're going to start with the two kinds of factoring. We're going to look at factoring by sum and product, and we're going to look at factoring difference of squares. So the first thing, let's define what does the word factoring mean, or what am I doing? Why am I factoring? What's going on here? So remember that what we talked about in previous videos, we said that there's three different kinds of quadratic. So you have the standard form, which is y equals ax squared plus bx plus c. And then we have the vertex form, y equals ax minus h squared plus k. And then we have the factored form, y equals x minus r, x minus s, or whatever letters you want there. And then we said that each one of these tells me something useful, right? So this tells me the y-intercept, this tells me the vertex, right? And then this one tells me the x-intercepts, right? And all of these key points are important for me to graph. And then sometimes it's easier if I have like a standard form and they want me to find when does the graph hit the ground or when does the graph intersect the x-axis. It's easier to have it in the factored form instead of in the standard form. So it's easier for me to go from the standard form to the factored form, find it in the factored form, and then find the x-intercepts. So what we talked about before, we talked about how can I go. So from before, we said that we can go from vertex form to standard form. And then we talked about expanding. So that was in the previous lesson. And then for expand. And then we did the same thing from the factored form to the standard form. We did expand as well. Now, what we're looking at the other way. So if I have the standard form, okay, how can I get to the factored form? And to get to the factored form, I need to follow a process called factoring. Okay, and this is what we're doing in this lesson. Now let's see what factoring means. What does factoring mean? So let's say factoring means you're breaking down something, okay? So if you have the number 12, what two numbers multiplies to give you 12? So you have different options. You can have 1 and 12, you can have 2 and 6, or you can have 3 and 4. These are the multiple options for multiplying into 12. So when you're breaking down 12, you're breaking it into either 1 times 12, or 3 times 4, or 2 times 6. Now, remember that we're going to have terms with letters, right? So if I have, let's say, 12a squared, and I want to break it down, I want to factor it, I want to split it, I'm looking at two terms. So basically, I'm looking for something times something that gives me 12a squared. Now, we looked at 12 and we said 1 times 12, 3 times 4, or 2 times 6, right? But if I'm looking at a squared, remember that to get a squared, you need to have an a and an a, because a times a gives you a squared. So in this case, to get 12a squared, you need 3a times 4a. That's an example. It could be 1a times 12a. That gives you also 12a squared. Or it could be 2a times 6a. That will also give you 12a squared. Okay, so remember that you also have to split your variable, not only the number. So let's see, why do we need to know all of this? So let's remember some, or let's recall some of the terminologies that we were going to be using. First terminology that we're going to be using is called trinomial. Trinomial is a term that says tri. Tri means three, okay? So that means it's three terms, three different terms that are added or subtracted together, okay? So if I have, let's say, 2x squared plus 5x plus 1, this is a trinomial because I have three terms that are added or subtracted together, okay? A binomial is two terms because the word bi. So a trinomial is often the result of multiplying two binomials together, okay? And we did that in the previous lesson. And we had, let's say, we said we did the FOIL, right? So if, let's say I had, in this case, x plus 2 times x plus 5, right? If you remember, we did the FOIL, so x times x gives me x squared, x times 5 gives me 5x, 2 times x gives me 2x, and 2 times 5 gives me 10. Yes, as you can see here, I have four terms, but because I have two like terms, the 5x and the 2x, I can add them together, and that would end up being x squared plus 7x plus 10, which is a trinomial in three terms. So what I had here is I had a binomial multiplied by another binomial, and I expanded them to give me a trinomial. So this is what we did in the previous lesson, right? Where I went from factored form to standard form following the expanding method. All right? Now what we're going to do, we're going to move the other way. So we're going to learn how to go from the standard form to the factored form. All right? Now, so all equations that we're going to learn how to factor in this grade, in the grade 11 college, is going to have an a value of 1. So the leading coefficient is going to be 1. So you remember how the factored form is y equals ax squared plus bx plus c. In the case of grade 11 college math, all the a values are going to be 1. So the only one that we're going to learn how to factor are things that look like this. So x squared plus whatever b is, x plus whatever c is, okay, where your a term is 1. All right, so let's see how do we do that. Now, before we go to that, I want to ask you a question. So in the factored form, I had x plus 2 times x plus 5, and then I ended up with x squared plus 7x plus 10. I want you to think about these two numbers, and I want you to tell me, what's the relation do you think is between 2 and 5? So what can I do to 2 and 5 in order to get 7 and in order to get 10? So how does 2 and 5, if I subtract them, I add them, I multiply them, I divide them, I square root them, what do I do to 2 and 5 to get 7? And what do I do with 2 and 5 to get 10? Is there any relation there? So if you're looking at this, you should right now know that if you add the 2 and the 5, that's going to give you the 7. And if you multiply the 2 and the 5, that's going to give you the 10. So if I add the 2 and the 5, gives me the middle term. And then if I multiply the 2 and the 5, that gave me the last term. Do you think that's going to be always the case? So if I, let's say, had x minus 3 times x minus 5, is that going to give me 8 in the middle, or negative 8 in the middle, and then positive 15 at the end? Would that give me this? Because if I add negative 3 and negative 5, that's going to give me negative 8. And if I multiply negative 3 and negative 5, that's going to give me 15. So if I do the FOIL, would that be the case? Let's see. Okay, so remember these two numbers. So, oops, left it there. So let's try to factor. I'm gonna erase here, and I'm gonna try to, expand it here. Okay, so let's do the FOIL. So I have x minus 3, x minus 5, and then we're gonna expand. So that's gonna give me x squared minus 5x minus 3x plus 15, and that's gonna give me x squared minus 8x plus 15. I've guessed that. You see? I have guessed that. So basically, this middle term here is the sum of these two numbers, and the last term is the product. Product means multiplication of these two numbers. All right, so keep that in mind. So here is an example. So we call this process, whenever I have a trinomial and I'm trying to factor that trinomial, okay, we call that process the sum and product. So I have a trinomial, and to factor the trinomial, you follow a process called sum and product. All right, so remember that the middle term was the sum of the two factors, and the last term is the product of the two factors. Okay, so if I have this example here, which is c squared minus 5c plus 6, I'm going to have to look for two numbers that multiply to the last term and add to the middle term. So multiply to 6 and add to negative 5. Okay, so here's what I do usually. On the side, I do multiply to 6, so product of 6 and sum of negative 5. So what multiplies to 6? Multiplies to 6 usually 2 and 3 and 6 and 1. I don't have too many options. But because they add to a negative number, that means both of them are going to be negative. Okay, so this is one of the rules. Because they multiply to a positive and they add to a negative, then they both have to be negative. Okay, because negative and negative makes positive, and negative plus negative gives you a negative. So negative 2 minus 3, that gives you a negative 5. Negative 6 minus 1, that gives you a negative 7. Because I'm looking for the answer negative 5, then I know that my two factors are negative 3 and negative 5. So then I can factor this to, so you make two brackets. In the first bracket, you're going to put the c term in the c, because you see how the square root of c squared gives you c, so you're going to put c here. And then the second thing is going to be the numbers. So I have negative 2 and negative 3, so I'm going to put negative 2 and negative 3, and now it's in factored form. Okay, so you see how I went from standard form to factored form by following what we call the sum and product process. Okay, now you can check this work. I can check this and make sure that I've got it right. So to check this, you can do the expanding. So if I do c squared and then minus 3c minus 2c plus 6, and that's going to be c squared minus 5c plus 6. This is exactly what I started with, so I have checked my work and this is correct. Okay, the checking your work is not mandatory, it's just for you to know that you've done your process right, okay, or your question was correct. So remember, in order for you to factor a trinomial, okay, so if I have a trinomial, and remember in this case a is equal to 1, so I have x squared plus bx plus c, you're looking for two numbers that multiply to C to get C, and then and add to B. Okay, so you're looking for two numbers that multiply to get your last term, which is C, and add to your middle term, which is B. Now, here's something that you probably want to write down as a note, a side note for you. Okay, so what happens if B So if B is positive and C is positive, then both factors are going to be positive. Okay? Now, if B is positive and C is negative, so you're looking for two numbers that multiply to a negative number, but then they add to a positive number. In this case, the bigger number is positive, and the smaller number, the smaller factor, is negative. So if I have a case where I have, let's say, y equals x squared plus x minus 6, right? So in this case, my factors for 6 are 3 and 2, 6 and 1, okay? So in this case, because B is positive and C is negative, so B is positive, C is negative, then the bigger number is going to be positive and the smaller number is going to be negative. So the bigger number is positive and the smaller number is negative. Positive, negative, right? So in this case, negative 3 minus 2, that gives me 1. And 6 minus 1, that gives me 5. So this is the correct answer. And then one of your factors is positive, the other one is negative, and the bigger one is positive. Okay? Now, if B is negative and C is negative, then the smaller, let's start with the bigger. The bigger number in this case is going to be negative, and the smaller is positive. Okay, so if I have a negative here, right, then a negative for the x, then the negative 3 plus 2, that gives me a negative 4. If B is negative and C is positive, then both answers are negative, okay? Because negative times negative gives you a positive, and negative gives you a negative when you add them together, okay? So remember, write this table somewhere, okay? Because that's gonna help you understand, or that's gonna help you find your factors pretty easily, right? It's not that they're gonna help you find the numbers, it's just gonna help you understand that all my numbers have to be positive and negative or something like this, okay? All right. So let's look at another one. Y squared plus 8y plus 15. Let's try to factor them. So y squared plus 8y plus 15. So this is your B, this is your C. So I'm looking for two numbers that has a product of 15 and has a sum of 8. So what multiplies to 15? I don't have that many options. 15, that's 1 and 15, or 3 and 5. 1 and 15, they add to 16. 3 and 5 add to 8, right? So because this is the right answer, then I know that it's going to be 3 and 5. So that means this is going to factor out to y plus 3, y plus 5. Okay, and that's it. You're done. This is the factored form. So keep practicing these factoring techniques or the sum and product. So I know, why do I factor? Why do I need to factor? If they're asking you, for example, they're asking you to sketch x squared plus 6x minus 16. How are you going to find your answer? How are you going to be able to graph? Right? Unless you sit down and do plug in X values to find the Y values and plug in X values to find the Y values, right? You need to be able to properly locate your specific points and your special points, and then to graph. So in the standard form, what I only know that my y-intercept is negative 16. That's all what I know. Now, in order for me to find your x-intercepts or the x-intercepts, what I need to do, I need to factor. Okay, and then to factor this, I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to negative 16. So the product of negative 16 and the sum of 6. So what multiplies to negative 16? Remember that we said if your product is negative and your sum is positive, so if B is positive, look at the thing that we just looked, the table that we just filled out. If B is positive and C is negative, then the bigger number is positive and the smaller number is negative. Okay, so remember that. What multiplies to negative 16? 16 and 1, right? Because the smaller is negative, then it's 16 and negative 1. What else? 8 and 2, right? Smaller is negative. What else? 4 and 4. Now, in this case, I don't have a smaller one, right? So let's say one is positive, the other one is negative, right? Now, if I'm going to find the sum, 16 plus minus 1, that's going to be 15. 8 plus negative 2, that's 6. There you go. I just got it, right? 8 and negative 2. So I know that this is going to factor to x plus 8 and x minus 2. Okay? Plus 8 minus 2. So this is where you're getting your answers from. Now, good. So far I know few points, right? So I know the y-intercept. Remember that the factored form, you can find the x-intercepts. And remember that the x-intercepts is you set each one equal to 0, right? So you set x plus 8 equal to 0. So that means x equals negative 8. And then you set this one equal to 0. Then x equals to 2. So I found the x-intercepts. These are your x-intercepts. Okay, so far you know that you have the x-intercept as negative 8 and the x-intercept at 2, and you know that you have the y-intercept at negative 16. All right, so one more thing that I would need, and that's the vertex. Once I find the vertex, then I can graph. I have 4 points, it's pretty clear. I can graph easily, okay? So to find the vertex, also remember, we talked about that before in the previous unit. And we said, if I know the zeros, to find the vertex, I need to find the middle point because the vertex, the axis of symmetry is in the middle between the two. So I need to find where here is going to be my axis of symmetry. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add my 2 zeros. So to find the axis of symmetry, I'm going to add my 2 zeros, and I'm going to divide by 2. So it's going to be negative 6 divided by 2, which is negative 3. So then I know that my axis of symmetry is going to be at negative 3. Now, how do I find the y value of that? If you remember, we plug in the axis of symmetry into the equation. So that means to find the y coordinate or the optimal value, I plug in negative 3 in for x. So that's going to be negative 3 plus 8, negative 3 minus 2. And that's going to be 5 times negative 5, and that's going to be negative 25. What they did here is they plugged it into the original formula. Doesn't matter. It shouldn't. These two are exactly the same. They're exactly the same function, just they look different because the different way that I have to write them between factors for them for form and standard form. Now, I know my vertex. My vertex is negative 3, negative 25. So that's where my vertex is. So you see that now my zeros are -8 and 2. My axis of symmetry is -3, and the y is at -25. So this is where my vertex is. And I know that my y-intercept is here, and I can sketch my graph. Okay? So that's why we need to know how to factor, right? Because then it's easy to find the zeros, and then it's easy to find the vertex form. So the equation h equals t squared minus 10t plus 16 represents the curved path that a high diver takes under the water. The variable h represents height above the water in meters, and t represents the time in seconds. At what time does the diver enter the water? So let's think about this for a second. H is the height of the diver above the water. Okay, and then if I'm looking at this one, if I'm looking at this graph, what I'm looking at, so this line here, this is basically my water line. Okay, my x-axis is my water line, because the height is the height of the diver above the water. Okay, so if it's negative, then he's now below the water. Okay, and what I know here is I know that my y-intercept is at 16. So that means I'm starting here at 16, and what's going to happen is the diver is going to go up, and then it's going to go down and enter the water. Okay? Picturing this, graphing this is going to help you solve. Now, what the question is asking you, it's asking you when or at what time does the diver enter the water. So if I'm looking at this, the diver enters the water right here. What do we call that point? We call it the x-intercept, right? So that means I need to know my x-intercepts. So remember that to find the x-intercept, I need to put it in factored form. And to put it in factored form, because I have a trinomial, I need to do sum and product. So I'm looking for two numbers with a product of 16 and sum of -10. And remember that if both of them are, if the product is positive, so if B is positive, sorry, if B is negative and C is positive, then basically what this is telling me that both of them are negative. So what multiplies to 16? 16 and 1, both of them has to be negative. 8 and 2, -8 and -2. And what else? 4 and 4, right? Now, this is going to be -17, this is going to be -10, and this is going to be -8. So my answer is -8 and -2. All right, so basically this is telling me that the diver is at the surface of the water. Actually, this could be that he's going from here to here, and that he's going to go this way. And I did make a mistake. Why did I make a mistake in my previous graph? What did I not consider? What did I not consider? I did not consider that A is positive. And if A is positive, that means it open up. So if A is positive, that means it opens up. So my graph is actually, should not be the blue one, it should be the red one, right? So where the initial is at 16, then the diver went down, hit the water, then all the way down, turned, and came back up above water. Okay, so the diver is at the surface of the water at 2 seconds, and 8 seconds. Okay, so he's entering the water at 2 seconds and he's exiting the water at 8 seconds. So now how long is a diver underwater? So because he entered at 2 and he left at 8, so he was underwater for 6 seconds, right? So here are some like application questions that we deal with quadratics. All right, so remember that this here, this blue graph is not correct. This is just for me initially looking at it, but I should have thought about, okay, A is positive, that means it opens up. So I should have thought of this. I did not think of this. So these are some mistakes that you can learn as you go. All right.